Okay, Erev Tov, good evening to everyone. And so let's start learning. Hope everyone is having a good week so far and is safe and well and managing as best as possible. Okay, so now that we spoke a little bit about vaccines, and Amir Tzashem, everything should be fine and people should be well and people should get the vaccines as soon as they're able and just be healthy and well. So let's learn a little bit of Torah. So as we think about our physical health, but we also derive tremendous energy and benefit from our spiritual connection to Torah. So Yasher Koach to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. And what I wanted to learn about tonight is the mitzvah of V'lifnei Iver lo titei michshol. This is a little bit of a sequel in a certain sense. I mean, it's not really a regular sequel, but in a certain sense, it's a sequel to the last shir, which was on the topic of lo samar al dam re'echa. If you remember, that shir was on the topic, on the mitzvah of don't stand idly by when your neighbor's blood is being spilled, and the idea of doing everything you can to assist another person who's in harm's way. And the reason why lifnei iver lo titei michshol in a certain sense is like a sister mitzvah is because it appears in the same parsha of Kedoshim, in the kind of like bein adam lechavero, in the interpersonal mitzvot section of Parshat Kedoshim. And the pasuk is a famous pasuk, and many of you are familiar, of course, with the pasuk, which is "V'lifnei iver lo titei michshol," which means literally that you should not place a stumbling block before the blind. In a literal sense, what perhaps this means is, what kind of cruel person would put a banana peel or a stumbling block in front of a blind person? But perhaps if we understand the pasuk literally, if a person is in construction and you have a building and you have an elevator, so in the elevator you should make sure to put braille on the numbers so that the blind are able to know what floor to go to. But the rabbis understood that this pasuk is not to be meant to be interpreted literally only, but rather to also be understood in a broader sense, than not to place a stumbling block in front of any person who's blind in that particular area. And the rabbis therefore understood that if a person could also be spiritually misguided. A person could lack clear vision and not have clarity when it comes to right and wrong, a mitzvah and an avera. And so the rabbis understood this pasuk, lifnei iver lo titei michshol, not just in a sense of don't put a stumbling block in front of a blind person who's blind, but they understood it that you should not do anything that might cause someone to commit a sin because they're really, spiritually blind. And so you're giving the person the ability or the will to do something wrong. That's putting a stumbling block in front of somebody who in a spiritual sense is blind. Now, this raises a lot of interesting questions. Are you allowed to invite a person to your home or to your shul on Shabbat for a simcha, or if it's to invite somebody to your home for a Shabbat meal, pre-COVID, post-COVID, when we remember those times where you had, were you able to have some people over at your home, or you able to go to somebody else's home for a Shabbat or Yom Tov meal? So are you allowed to invite somebody to your home on Shabbat if you know that's going to cause them to drive to your home? You know that maybe they could walk, maybe it's a 20-minute walk, a 25-minute walk, or a 30-minute walk, or maybe it's even more, but by extending the invitation, that is going to lead them to drive on Shabbat to your home for the meal. By inviting them to your simcha at Beth Jacob, so maybe they're going to drive to the shul. So we all know that a person is not supposed to, is not allowed to drive on Shabbat. At Beth Jacob, we don't ask people how they get to Beth Jacob. We know that every single Jew is in a different place of observance, in a different place on their religious journey. But we all know the law in the books is that a person is not allowed to drive on Shabbat. It reminds me something that I once heard from Rabbi Riskin, which is that I think he was saying it jokingly, but perhaps it was true, that a person left the Orthodox shul and started davening at the Reform congregation. And he said, Rabbi, the sermons are much shorter in the Reform congregation. And Rabbi Riskin responded, and I think he might have just been making up the story as a joke, but that he said that when does a rabbi prepare the sermon? He prepares it on the way to the synagogue. So the rabbi on Shabbat morning, the Orthodox rabbi, has a 15-minute walk to the synagogue, a 20-minute walk to the synagogue. So he prepares a 15, 20-minute sermon. But for the Reform who drive to the synagogue, it takes very quick to get to the shul, and that's why there's a much briefer sermon in the Reform congregation. And Rabbi Riskin used this because he was visiting. Happened to be in New York. He said, "Well, my trip from Israel to this synagogue, took 12 hours, but you don't have to worry. It's not going to be a 12-hour sermon." That was his opening joke. So that's a serious question. Joking aside, that's a serious question in terms of, can you invite somebody to your Shabbat meal? It could be, let's say if you're a Baal Tshuva and you've become observant, but you have a parent or parents who are not observant. So can you invite your parents or your friends or anyone to your Shabbat meal if it's going to cause them to drive? Another question could happen at work where a colleague, a Jewish non-observant colleague, says to you to go to the UCLA cafeteria and to pick up a cheeseburger, a chicken and cheese sandwich, or some non-kosher food. And you say to your colleague, and you're questioning whether you can go, because wait a second, you have to keep kosher. And your colleague says, "Hey, come on, Martin, come on, Bruce, come on, Lunny, come on, just do me a favor. Can you get me the food from the cafeteria?" So is it permitted for you, when you go to the cafeteria and you're going to purchase kosher food for yourself, in the package bags with the hechsher on it, but are you allowed to purchase food that doesn't have a hechsher, food that's non-kosher, for your Jewish colleague who's not observant? Or is that a problem of lifnei iver lo titein mechshel? Another question is, if you have a home, or you have a social hall, or you have a catering hall, and somebody wants to rent out your hall for a party or for a wedding that's not going to be in accordance with Jewish law. Is there a problem with a catering hall to rent out a hall to a party, to a family, if they're not going to do the chuppah or have the wedding in accordance with halacha? Is that a problem? What about a Jewish doctor who wants to change his call on Shabbat and he can't find any non-Jew to take his call? Now, there very often are exemptions for doctors or Hatzalah workers to give medical treatment on Shabbat. That's a complicated topic in its own right that we're not going to get into tonight. But let's say you have an Orthodox Jew who has a call in the hospital that's going to be on Friday night or Shabbat morning, and he'd prefer not to have to go into the hospital. So so it's ideal, I guess, if he could find a non-Jew to take his call. That's perfectly permissible. But is it permissible for a Jew to trade his call with another Jew who doesn't really care about Shabbos? And maybe he cares about Shabbos, but he doesn't care about observing the halachos of Shabbos. So is it permissible to change the call with that person? So there's a lot of interesting questions when it comes to this topic of lifnei iver. The Gemara establishes some very, very important principles whenever you want to talk about a question of lifnei iver. Now, lifnei iver again means you yourself, you're not going to do the prohibition, but it's causing somebody else, which is the issue. So the Gemara in Avodah Zarah Daf Vav says that that you're not allowed to give a cup of wine to a Nazir, because that's placing a stumbling block in front of the blind. Because a Nazir is not allowed to, right? A Nazir is someone who takes upon himself or herself the prohibition of not coming into contact with a corpse, not cutting his hair, and not drinking wine. So giving a cup of wine to a Nazir is a possible violation of the lifnei iver lo titein nechshel. The Gemara says also that you shouldn't give a limb of a living animal to a non-Jew, because that is a prohibition for a noachide, for a non-Jew. They're not supposed to eat aver min hachai. The Gemara therefore establishes here something very interesting, which is that this prohibition of lifnei iver is causing somebody to do something, wrong, whether that person is a Jew or a non-Jew. The mitzvah of lifnei iver only applies to a Jew, but you're not allowed to cause another person to stumble, or you're not allowed to place a stumbling block, a spiritual stumbling block, in front of any person, black or white, Jew or non-Jew, and you see from the Gemara that it's even a problem to give an aver menachai to a non-Jew. The Gemara says something very, very important, though, that there's only a problem on a Torah level, Stephanie and Nechama and everyone. It's only a Torah prohibition of lifnei iver when it's trei abra denara. Trei abra denara means two sides of the river. What does the Staten Island ferry or the boat ride to Catalina Island have to do with this? What the Gemara means to say is that where the person and the prohibition are on two sides of the river, and the only way the person can get the prohibition is by you bringing it from one side of the river to the other. You're the one with the boat. You're the one who has the helicopter. You're the one who has it's a metaphor. And the idea being that giving a cup of wine to a Nazir, or giving non-kosher food to a Jew, to any fellow Jew, is only a problem if they cannot get it on their own. If they have the will to have the non-kosher food, and they have the ability, Mike, to attain for themselves the non-kosher food, so then that's what the Gemara calls, Ron, chad abra dinara. Okay, Jerry and Madeline, you got that? Chad abra dinara. Chad abra dinara means where it's one side of the river. One side of the river means the person in question, meaning the potential, the person who's spiritually blind, who might commit the sin, where that person and the prohibition are on the same side of the river. Then, and if that's the case, even if you, Greg, if you provide the assistance to that person, that's not going to be a Torah prohibition, because that person already had the desire to do it, and he had the ability to do it on his own, but you're the one who provided the assistance. That's not going to be a Torah prohibition. It's only a Torah prohibition, Stephanie, if it's what's called trei abra dinara. Trei abra dinara means where the person and the prohibition are on two sides of the river, and he can't do it without your assistance. You're the one who's giving the person, either by giving him kind of like convincing him to do it, that's giving him the desire, or you're giving him the capacity, the ability to do it, because you're giving him the username and passcode to be able to, cheat on the examination, whatever it is. If you're the one that's giving him the ability, so that's going to be the Torah prohibition of lifnei iver lo titein nechshel. Okay? Rochelle, makes sense? Fran, Rev Green, Martin, Ayala, Esther, trying to give everyone a shout out here. Okay. So, and if I didn't give you a shout out, so consider yourself lucky. Now, okay. So that's the Gemara. Now that's the Gemara's, and the Chama. I think I gave you a shout out, right? But you're welcome, the Chama. Now the Ran says as follows. Rabbeinu Nisim in his commentary on the Gemara says as follows: that even in a case of chad abra dinara, where the person can do it on her own, and we said in that situation there's no Torah prohibition, the Ran says, you know what, but still there's going to be a rabbinic prohibition. that you're not supposed to be misayeya yidei ovri aveira. Yeah, there may not be a Torah prohibition of a stumbling block, but even if but if the person could do it on his own, even in that situation, you should not be involved in helping the person do it. And that's going to be a rabbinic prohibition. Now, Rav Moshe Feinstein quotes the opinions who say that there'll only be a rabbinic prohibition if there's a chance that you could talk the person out of it. But let's say you've had the conversation before with the person about the importance of having kosher food, or you just know there's no chance that you're going to be able to talk the person out of it. So then there's not even going to be a rabbinic prohibition of lifnei iver. So whenever you think about a question of, is this a problem of lifnei iver, you should have that construct, that framework of principles. Okay, is this something that the person can do on his own or not? If the person can do it on his own, so then there's no Torah prohibition. But maybe there's a way that that I don't have to be involved, and maybe there's a way for me to talk the person out of it. If the person could do it on his own, and there's no way that I could talk the person out of it, that's going to be a situation where it's going to be permitted, where it could very well be permitted, to be involved in whatever is being discussed. So let's talk about that case of going to the cafeteria. Okay, you work at UCLA, and there's a cafeteria there. I don't know. I haven't checked the cafeteria in UCLA recently, but my guess is that they have some not kosher food and some kosher food at the UCLA cafeteria. So, and your colleague says to you, "Hey, Ruvain, George, you're going down for lunch. Do you mind bringing me a chicken parmesan?" Is it permitted to buy the chicken parmesan sandwich for your friend, Rick, your Jewish friend Rick, who's a nurse at UCLA?
Oh, Rabbi Topp.
Yep.
It's Stephanie. What about the issue of you don't want it to look like the cheeseburger is kosher?
Nice. So that's what Ruth is saying, and Stephanie, you're saying, which is that, and that's my mother-in-law. Hi, Mom, Ruthie Engel. So that's good old Morris. I don't know if we have any Morrises on the phone, but good old Morris. Mike's brother is Morris. Good old Morris Ayin. Right? That a person should not do anything that. Now, there's two reasons why you're not supposed to do anything suspicious. One is because people will think that you're not religious, and they'll think, and they'll look down on you, or they'll judge you, and they'll have a negative perception of you because you're doing something wrong. The other possibility is that if somebody sees you purchasing the food or doing the action in question, they might think that the action in question is permitted, or that the food is kosher. Those are two different reasons, as the commentaries give, for marasayin, right? We generally, it's not only important to do the right thing, but you should do things that are going to be viewed as the right thing by others. Now, there's a whole discussion that's a whole separate shir. That doesn't mean that we're always looking over our shoulder, to see what everyone else is thinking of us. But it's the pasuk v'yisem nikiyem me'Hashem miYisrael, that you should be clean and pure in the eyes of Hashem, but also in the eyes of Israel. So I agree with you, Stephanie, which is that would be a problem for you to go to the UCLA cafeteria and buy a cheeseburger. There may be people that are going to see you doing that, and either they'll think, oh, Stephanie, and I know that she's a very religious person, and if she's getting that burger, that maybe the burger's kosher. Or they'll say, oh gosh, Stephanie's buying the burger. I know that's not kosher, and what happened to Stephanie? So there may be a separate problem of marasayin, but let's say there is no problem of marasayin. Let's say it's a situation where it's clear that it's not a problem of anyone getting the wrong idea. Is it permitted to go to the caf and get your colleague the food? Is it a Torah prohibition of lifnei iver?
It sounds like it's the rabbinic prohibition, forgetting the marit ayin, okay? It would be the rabbinic one, because unless you try to talk him out of it or her, and they insisted, look, forget it, that's me. You don't have to do it, I do it. Can you pick it up for me or not? And that's the end of that conversation. So that's where we are. That's what I
That's
think.
right. So I would say is that I would think that I agree with you. There's no Torah prohibition of lifnei iver because the person can do it on his own, and he has the desire to do it, and he can go down himself to the cafeteria. So there's no Torah prohibition. There may be a rabbinic prohibition of misayeya, but if you've had the conversation before with the person, and you know that this is the way they are and this is what they're going to do, then it could be that it's permitted for you to do it. Now you still might say you're not comfortable doing something like that, and maybe it's a little bit unfair for your friend, for your colleague to put you in that position. But and you might say, personally, I'm not going to do it, and I ideally one shouldn't do it, but I think you can make an argument that it's permitted, assuming that it's not a problem with Marasayan. You can make an argument that it's permitted for the reasons that we just said. Rav Moshe Feinstein has an interesting take on the catering hall question, where he says, now look, if it's a catering hall and you're the caterer, so then it'll be presumably kosher food. But let's say if it's just renting out a space and the people are going to bring not kosher food, again, it's not something to write home about. But Rav Moshe Feinstein says, let's say you sell somebody, a knife. It's a kitchen knife. If God forbid they do something wrong with the knife, that wasn't anything wrong that you did. Or let's say you give somebody, you lend somebody or you sell someone pots and pans. So the pot is a permitted item. You don't have to worry, and it's not your responsibility to worry that, they might make not kosher food in that pot. Okay, I'm not getting in the question of tefillah that the pot has to be immersed separately, but let's say it's your pot, and your neighbor comes and wants to borrow it, and they really need it, so you can give it to them, even though there may be a concern that they're gonna use not kosher. It's not going to be a problem of lifnei iver because you're giving them something permitted. They're the ones who are taking that item and doing something prohibited. There's to give a cup of wine to a nazir, that's a prohibited object. To give a cheeseburger to someone, that's a prohibited object. To give a person dairy when they just had fleishik, they just had the meat, so that's a prohibited activity. But to give somebody a pot, that's permitted. And they might come and use the pot for not kosher. That's their decision. It's not going to be a problem of lifnei iver. Now, look, if it's your pot and you're lending it to your neighbor, and there's a concern that it's not kosher, then you're gonna have to be ready to kasher the pot. You're gonna have to be ready to kasher the pot. That's right. But your neighbor really needs it, and it's very important, and they would really love if you could lend it to them, and it's a pot. Okay, so lend it to them, and then when you get it back, you kasher the pot. That's not a problem with neighbor. You're lending them the pot. So Rav Moshe Feinstein says similarly,
The pot.
if you have a room, if you have a space, the room is a kosher thing. It's a room. It's not intrinsically a prohibited item that you're giving them, and therefore Rav Moshe says that it's permitted to give a person or a family a space, even if there is a chance that they're going to do something that's not in accordance with Jewish law. Now, look, if it's God forbid, if it's something that they're planning to do that's illegal, or if it's something that's a violation of Torah and it's within your legal rights not to rent it out to them, that's a different story. If it's something illegal, maybe then that's a separate. You got to talk to your lawyer about that. But in terms of lifnei iver, to give them the space. The space is intrinsically a permitted item.
Slicha, you can kosher a pot after someone treifs it up
100%.
Sure.
because it's metal.
Because it's metal.
But what if it's one of those like painted kind of a pot, like ceramic?
A ceramic pot or a ceramic dish cannot be koshered.
No.
Okay, that's what I thought.
But a regular metal pot or metal silverware can be koshered for Pesach and can be koshered if it became treif.
Okay, that I know, but I have some pots that have enamel on it, and I'm thinking I can't kosher that. Okay, thank you.
Rabbi, I want to bring Maimonides into the discussion. He's got some very interesting example. For example, a guy who gets paid and goes to a casino, he's supposed to give the money for his family for food and stuff, and he sees the big machine, $1 million pot, and he loses all his money. That's lo tasim michshol lifnei iver, because basically the casino actually, enticed him to come in there. So Maimonides, same with interest. You need some money to buy food or something that you need for the family. And the guy says, I'll give it to you for 20%, usually. The guy says, sure, I'll take the money, and then he can pay. That's lo tasim michshol lifnei iver. But here's the interesting example. A father hits his son, his older son, and the son actually hits him back. Now, that's lo tasim michshol because the father prevented the son from doing kibud av ve'em because he hit him and the son hit him back.
Yeah, go ahead, Ron. Continue.
And the last thing is Israeli courts.
You're
In
absolutely
Israeli
right,
courts-
Ron. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
And in Israeli courts, it's used all the time. A guy goes and parks his car in a public park, and he gets $100 ticket. He goes to the judge. The judge says to the municipality, did you have a sign in there? He says no, but everybody knows you're not supposed to park there. He says he didn't know. You didn't have a sign. That's lo tasim michshol lifnei iver. And the last thing with the Israeli, entrapment. In Israeli courts, there's no such thing as entrapment. If you have a policeman who is one of those, undercover cops, and he gives narcotics to somebody and the guy takes it, you can't convict it because that's lo tasim michshol lifnei iver. The court will throw it out. It's not like here. Here, it's not counted as entrapment. In Israel, it is. So just differences. But the judge will use that word, lo tasim michshol lifnei iver, because you entrap the guy and he wouldn't have done it unless you actually enticed him to do that.
Thank you, Ron, for all those really, really fascinating examples. That's really, really great. And the Gemara does say that. Thanks for bringing the Rambam into it. And the Gemara does say that about a parent hitting a child, that's in a certain sense lifnei v'lo titin michshol, because that'll cause the child to strike the parent or it could cause the child to strike the parent in response, and which is considered, of course, a very, very grave Torah prohibition.
Rabbi, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
When I was doing my basic training in the Israeli army, it was at an abandoned fort on the West Bank. And the last Shabbat that my group was there, we were assigned to guard the fort. And there was one fellow who was from Me'as Sharim in our group that was assigned to the gate, which was the entrance to the fort, an electric gate. And he went to the commander and told him he couldn't do it and asked to be switched with someone else. Should I have intervened and said, you're not allowed to do that? Because the fellow who he was switched with was obviously a non-observant Jew.
And what was required? What was required to operate the gate? You had to electronically operate the gate.
For vehicles that were entering or leaving the gate, he had to open the gate by pulling a switch.
And this was for the security. This was for the security of the community.
Obviously.
This was obviously for the security of the community, which is b'koach nefesh, and there needed to be somebody. There needed to be somebody to do it. So that's a very, very interesting. That's a very, very interesting question. That's very similar to the Shabbos call to the Shabbos call for the doctor question. Jerry, that's very interesting that you're sharing that experience, and Yasher Koach to you for your service. And I think that would get into that would get, as if I think it's permitted. That's an interesting question. Meaning, because if this other person is anyway gonna maybe be watching TV or listening to the radio, or I guess if it's in the 21st century on his phone or whatever, then instead of doing that, maybe better for him to be operating that door. At least that's for the security for Pekuach
Everybody in
Nefesh.
the group was doing guard duty.
What'd you say?
Everybody in our group was that Shabbat was assigned to do guard duty. So we were guarding the fort. Like I was stationed at a position with my rifle, but and all I did during that day was holding the rifle. Now this other fellow, who the observant Jew switched with, would have ended up doing the same thing. Instead, he was told to switch with the fellow and operate the gate on Shabbat, which it didn't bother him because he wasn't dati.
Wait, but Rabbi, if you said it's pikuach nefesh, then the dati could have also operated the gate, because if it's pikuach nefesh, doche Shabbat.
Yeah. So this is a very interesting question, because the Pekuach Nefesh overrides Shabbat. Jerry and his whole group were involved in guard duty. They were doing different tasks, some of which did not involve the same level of violation of Shabbat. Like Jerry was just holding the rifle. It's a problem of muksa, but that's not a Torah violation of Shabbat. So even though there's the leniency of Pekuach Nefesh that allows the opening and closing of the gate, but it strikes me that it is a good idea that to give it to somebody who anyway is not going to observe Shabbos. Anyway, give it to the person who doesn't care about it, to operate the gate. Being that he doesn't mind, it strikes me as a reasonable thing to do. If the Mea Sharim, the Jew who, I guess it would have been permitted for him to open and close the gate, because that's his responsibility to do security, and it's for Pekuach Nefesh. He should do it with a shinui. He should do it with a deviation. Do it with a certain instrument or something like that. But it sounds reasonable to at least give that job to somebody who anyway would be, violating Shabbos over the course of the day. But that's
how about a non-Jew, like a Jew?
Let me get into some interesting details here. I want to talk about the Shabbos question. Ida, with your permission, and everyone, and Ron, I want to talk about the Shabbos invitation question, because that's really a hot topic. You're allowed to invite somebody if it's going to cause them to drive on Shabbat. By the way, regarding the doctor switching his call, Rav Moshe Feinstein says that a religious doctor is allowed to switch his call with a Jewish non-observant doctor. Rav Moshe Feinstein says you're allowed to do that. The reason is because if he's not working in the hospital, so then he's going to be violating Shabbat without any justification. If he's working in the hospital, at least there's some justification of Pekuach Nefesh for what he's doing. And Jerry, I think that relates to what you're saying. I mean, Rosh Shlomo Zalman has a different take on it, but Jerry, in terms of Rav Moshe saying it's permitted to switch the call, then in a certain sense, to me, that sounds similar it's a little bit different because but it sounds similar that you're allowed to give it over to the Jewish non-observant to open and close the door in your stead, in your place.
And by the way, Rabbi,
I want to get to the question of, Ron, with your permission, I want to move forward in terms of, are you allowed to invite somebody to your house if they're going to drive? And this is a very, very interesting question, and it gets us into what's the nature of the prohibition of a lifnei iver. And there's two different schools of thought when it comes to this. One possibility is to say that there's an independent prohibition of not placing a stumbling block in front of somebody who's blind. And it's an independent prohibition, And the nature of that independent prohibition is that you're not allowed to give a person bad advice. You're not allowed to do anything, whether it's advice, whether it's a physical action, that'll lead the person to doing something that's harmful to him or her. And if this is the case, it applies to business advice, to bad fashion advice,
Stock market.
to bad spiritual advice. That's right. If a person gives a person bad advice when it comes to investment, maybe that's also a violation of the lifnei iver lo titen michshol. He's financially blind in the sense of, not being savvy or aware of some of the principles of investing. The other possibility is to say as follows, which is that maybe the nature of the prohibition of lifnei iver is that it attaches in a certain sense to every particular avera. In other words, that there's a prohibition to eat not kosher. Lifnei iver teaches us that there's also a prohibition not to cause a person to eat not kosher. And then when you cause a person to eat not kosher, in a certain sense, it's as if you ate not kosher yourself. Where am I getting this from? Well, the Gemara has a concept called yatsa motzi. Let's say a person didn't say Kiddush on Shabbos. Are you allowed to, and you said Kiddush already. Are you allowed to say Kiddush again for that person? Now you'll say, wait a second, that's crazy. Isn't that a blessing made in vain? Ayala, what do you say?
I was going to say that if that person wasn't going to make Kiddush or doesn't know how to make Kiddush, I understand you're allowed to say the Kiddush again for that person.
Why? But why? Isn't that a blessing made in vain?
It's not in vain if the other person gets something out of it.
Ah, okay, very good. If the other person gets something out of it, you're allowed to do it, and you're absolutely right. That if you already said Kiddush, and there's another person who hasn't heard Kiddush, and either doesn't want to say Kiddush or doesn't know how to say Kiddush, then you're allowed to, whether you're a man or a woman, you're allowed to say Kiddush again for that person. The Ran says it like this. He says it beautifully. He says, well, the Gemara calls this yatsa motzi. Yatsa motzi, which means that even though you fulfilled the mitzvah, you were yatsa motzi. You can do the mitzvah again to fulfill the requirement for another person. And the Ran says it like this, Martin. The Ran says, you want to know why? Because Kol Yisrael arevim zelazeh. Every single Jew is a guarantor, is responsible for one another. That's not just a fancy principle that we have in summer camp. That's the color war theme. No, this is a real halachic principle, which is that we're all interlocked and interconnected with one another. And so the Ran says that if you have a person in the shul or in the community who didn't hear Kiddush, in a certain sense, you have not completely fulfilled your obligation of Kiddush. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to walk around Beverly Hills or Los Angeles or Brooklyn to make sure that every single Jew said Kiddush. What it means is if you're aware of someone who hasn't said Kiddush and you can help that person fulfill the mitzvah, in a certain sense, until that person does it, if the person hasn't done it yet, there's something lacking in your fulfillment. And therefore, even though you said Kiddush already, you're allowed to say Kiddush again for the other person, because in a certain sense, that's part of your obligation. In the converse is that if the Gemara says that if you have the ability to prevent someone from committing an aveira and you don't, then you're held responsible. If you have the ability to positively impact and be a role model for your community and you don't, then you're held accountable. So both for mitzvot and also for aveirot, we're interconnected with one another. And therefore, if we're talking about aveirot, talking about sins, if you cause someone in any way to commit a sin, we view it in a certain sense as if you committed the sin. Nissan, you got the Chakira? The two ways of looking at it. All right. Now, what are the nafkaminas? What are the nafkaminas? Okay, what are the practical differences between these two ways of looking at it? Well, what about where it's a rabbinic prohibition? If you, okay, you know a person had a fleishik meal. They come to your house, and it's 20 minutes after the fleishik meal that they had. Are you allowed to serve them something that's dairy? Well, I'm not having milk and meat together, and he doesn't know about it. So I'm just going to serve him dairy. So that now there's no Torah prohibition to have dairy 20 minutes after meat, but there is a rabbinic prohibition to have dairy 20 minutes after meat. The way Rav Shechter put it once, or Virtual Shechter, which is to have meat and milk together is a Torah prohibition. To have dairy within the hour after meat is a rabbinic prohibition. The idea of waiting 6 hours, right? That's a widespread custom, both among Sfardim and Ashkenazim. Widespread custom, which in Minhag Yisrael is to wait 6 hours. That's a minhag. Okay, it's an important custom. Okay, in the Yekasha custom, Jews of German descent, wait 3 hours. But so that's a custom. So you have a Torah prohibition, you have a rabbinic prohibition, you have a custom. If you're talking about if you cause somebody to commit a rabbinic prohibition, could that be a Torah violation of Lifnei Iver? If you serve somebody dairy, ice cream, and you say it's soy ice cream, why? Because you bought it from the store, you wanted to get soy, but then you look at you have all these guests over, and this is your dessert, and then you look and it says, "Oh, you bought the wrong ice cream." But it's after the meal. Come on, it's after the meal. You heard from the rabbi there's no Torah prohibition, only rabbinic prohibition. So if you serve that dairy to your guests, you're going to be causing them to commit a rabbinic violation.
But doesn't the
guest
guest
sin on a rabbinic level? So could that be a Torah prohibition of a Lifnei Iver?
But doesn't the guest have the right to refuse it and say, no, I can't? Where's the guest's responsibility?
But the
No.
guest is not an observant Jew, so therefore you're the one who's putting it in front of him. I think in a case like that, you must have something parv as well and make it clear. This is dairy, this is not. And
It's a couple of things. Number one, he might not be observant, so he doesn't care. Number two, maybe he is observant, but you tell him it's, everyone assumes it's parav. When you serve ice cream at the end of a meal, I don't know, maybe somebody asks whether it's parav. You don't even ask whether it's parav because everyone knows that there's parav ice cream. And if Fran Feynman invited me to her house, and she's serving dessert, of course Fran is not going to be serving dairy after a meat meal.
No.
So another possibility is where just putting the ice cream in front of the person might tempt the person to have it. So yeah, meaning in any of these scenarios, could it be a Torah prohibition? So what the Gemara says is something interesting. The Gemara says that if you cause somebody to violate Chol HaMoed, the intermediate days, that's considered a Torah prohibition of Lifnei Iver. So some of the commentaries say, you see from here that because the prohibition on Chol HaMoed is rabbinic. The concept of Chol HaMoed is a Torah concept, but the prohibition of doing creative activity, of doing work on Chol HaMoed is rabbinic. You see from here that causing somebody to commit a rabbinic prohibition is a Torah violation of Lifnei Iver. And then you have other commentaries that learn that Gemara and say, no, what you see from this Gemara is that work on Chol HaMoed is a Torah prohibition. When I say work, I mean certain kinds of work, right? There's certain things that you're allowed to do on Chol HaMoed, right? You're allowed to drive and turn on lights and do many things on Chol HaMoed. But there are some things that you're not supposed to do on Chol HaMoed. That's for a different shir. But if it's something that's prohibited on Chol HaMoed, so the other commentaries say, you see from here that if it's a Torah prohibition of Lifnei Iver, it must be that it's a Torah prohibition to do work on Chol HaMoed. So perhaps I'd like to suggest that it depends on these two ways of looking at it. If you say that the nature of Lifnei Iver is that it's an independent prohibition of giving somebody bad advice. So then if you cause the person to do any kind of sin, that's going to be causing some type of spiritual harm to that person. Whether it's a Torah prohibition you're causing him to do, or a rabbinic prohibition you're causing him to do, or you're causing him to violate a custom, whatever it might be, that's going to be a Torah prohibition of giving a person bad spiritual advice. Whether it's bad fashion advice, bad business advice, or bad spiritual advice, or you cause a person to do an Aveira, that's going to be a Torah prohibition. However, if you say that the nature of the prohibition of Lifnei Iver is that when you cause a person to do an Aveira, it's as if you did the Aveira yourself, then you can make an argument that if it's only a rabbinic prohibition, that what we're talking about, then at most it's going to be a rabbinic prohibition of Lifnei Iver lo titin nechshol. You hear what I'm saying? Let me give you another practical difference. What happens if you give the person the tools to do the sin, but in the end they don't do it? You put up the wrong sign, or you don't have the signs up, Ron, right? Or let's say the father hits the child, but the child doesn't hit the father back, or whatever it might be. You give the person the tools to do a sin, but in the end they don't do the sin. Were you in violation of Lifnei Iver lo titein nechshol? Interesting question, right, Bruce? Interesting question. So if you say that the nature of the prohibition is the lo titein, that you can't give the person the bad advice, you can't give the person the argument that'll convince him to want to do it, then it's a prohibition that you did, whether or not the person committed the sin at the end. However, if you say that no, right, that the nature of the prohibition is that if you cause a person to commit a sin, it's as if you did the sin yourself, then you can make an argument that you're only in violation of Lifnei Iver if ultimately the person committed the sin. And this is a machlokas rishonim. It's a machlokas rishonim whether if you gave the wine to the Nazir and then it spilled on the floor. So there's a debate, were you in violation of Lifnei Iver? And it could depend on these two ways of looking at it. Another machlokas is there Yahareg Val Yavor on Lifnei Iver lo titin nechshol? Right? We know that the person can never, you're never allowed to commit murder. What about causing somebody or giving somebody the tools and the desire to commit murder? So that's wrong. You can't do that. What about if your life is in stake? Would you have to give up your life before doing that? That might also depend on, do you view it as an independent prohibition of Lifnei Iver, or is it that it attaches to whatever the Aveira is that you're discussing? Very interesting machlokas rishonim between the Balamor and the Ramban about whether it's Yahareg Val Yavor. But now here's the thing about the Shabbos invitation, okay? The Shabbos invitation. What do you think? What do you think? I want to open it up to, Ayala. Let's see if we can give a couple other people a shot at it.
No problem.
I want to hear your thoughts also. What are your thoughts about the Shabbos invitation? Yeah, Lani, if you want to say about that or whatever you want to say.
Yeah, I just think that I'm surprised that it's considered a michshol, because I think that inviting someone for Shabbat and letting them enjoy Shabbat and experience Shabbat as Shabbat should be experienced by someone who perhaps is learning or experiencing for the first time, I think it's a wonderful thing. And if they're coming by car, I think it's okay. It's like, what are you going to say to somebody who's coming to shul and wants to experience shul? You're going to say, don't come because you're driving. So I think I don't see it as a michshol. In fact, I think it's something that it's a wonderful thing. It's hachnasat orchim. You're opening up a whole way of life to this person. So I definitely don't think it's a michshol. So I wanted to say that about the Shabbat invitation. And the other thing I'm really surprised about is to hear about the hall. I mean, would you rent out the hall in Beth Jacob to people who are going to treif it up?
Okay, so great, because thank you, Lani. Let's address that point, because Martin wrote a comment. Would the shul rent out Chappelle Sanctuary to an organization that might, for example, have a concert featuring Kol Isha? So that's right, meaning the shul, So look, the shul, the shul stands for, for halacha, for tefillah, Torah, for
Okay.
halacha.
So not the shul, but just say, a kosher hall. The people
Right.
who own a kosher hall, would they be allowed to rent it out to people who they know are going to serve a treif? It's going to be a non-kosher affair. Are you saying that that's okay? I
So
understand the shul.
let me just, yeah. So
Category.
so let's why, because you think you're surprised. You would think that should be wrong. A person shouldn't do that.
The same with the pot thing.
The pot also.
About the pot, you could explain to your neighbor, I'll give you the pot.
What are you going to say to the neighbor? I'll give you the pot, but on condition that you only
just enjoy the pot.
take the pot.
But anyway, the hall is a serious matter, especially.
I think the hall is a serious matter. I think technically speaking, it probably is not a violation of lifnei v'lo titen michshol, but I think it could very well be hashkafically, and in terms of optics, and in terms of what kind of behavior you're trying to promote. I think it's probably a good idea, if you can, to not rent it out to a family or a simcha if they're going to do something that's really wrong. So I would agree with you. It's probably not lifnei iver, because Rav Moshe also says, because if they don't rent your hall, they're going to rent another place. So they want to do the party in the way they want. Now, look, if you have a way to talk them out, let's say they're planning to have not kosher, and you could explain to them the benefits of eating kosher, then you should really do that. In any case, I think that might be a good. I want to think about that more. I think technically speaking, let's say they're going to do the simcha the way they want, and if they don't rent your hall, they're going to rent a different hall. Then there's probably not a problem of lifnei iver, but it might be something that you want to avoid doing anyway. It's you don't want to rent out your hall to a place that's going to have treif in your hall. So I would think that better to avoid that, just because it just doesn't feel right.
You should pause the rules.
I would agree with that. Now, in terms of the shul, the shul stands for tefillah, for Torah, for halacha, and the shul would not rent out Chappelle Sanctuary to an organization if they're not going to follow halacha. It's maris ayin, and it's not the right thing to do. Regarding the Shabbos question, Lani, I think you said it. I think you put it beautifully in terms of it not being a michshol. I want to get other thoughts first, and then I want to come back to Lani, what you said about the Shabbos invitation. Any other thoughts about the Shabbos invitation?
Yes.
Yes, so Rochelle. Remember, unmute yourself, Rochelle. While Rochelle is trying to unmute herself, Ayala, go ahead.
So I think it was at a shir, we discussed the idea of inviting someone who is not from. Yes, it's important to bring him in for a Shabbos meal to teach him how beautiful Shabbat is and all that. But I was told, and it's a little awkward sometimes, that when you invite them, you say, would you like to sleep at our house? Because I know you cannot drive. One should not drive, not you cannot. One should really not drive on Shabbat. Would you like to sleep here? Now they could choose to say, either they'll take you up on it, or they'll say, look, for us, it doesn't matter. And then you're absolved of responsibility for causing a violation.
Excellent. Ayala, I'm so glad that you raised that point. We'll come back to it in a moment. Yeah, Rochelle.
Yeah, I think you have to know who you're talking to, and I don't think you have to be embarrassed to tell them what you can and cannot do, and to say, look, I know you drive, I'm obligated to, I really want you to come. If you want to come, some people really, really want to be at that Shabbat meal, but they don't want to keep Shabbos. So you have to make the determination, you have to make your offers and let them do what they want, but you have to put on the table what the parameters are and leave it up to them.
Okay, great
But-
point in terms of you have to know.
But you have to know who you're inviting. If it's someone who is a family member and you'd really rather they not drive, you don't invite them. But if you want them to have a Seder, they're not going to have one, then you do. But, it gets so tricky. Like, can you cook on Shabbos can you cook for a Gentile? Can you cook for, someone who's intermarried? These things get so tricky. So you really have to know who you're inviting and what you're doing, and they need to know what they're doing. And I think you really have to be honest with them about what your obligations are. I don't think people are insulted by that if you explain it in the right way.
Okay, very, very nice, very nice. Yeah, Jerry, go ahead.
When I was a youngster, my grandfather, who was a ger chassid, a very learned man, when he had his Pesach Seder, my cousins would also attend. And I think my grandfather felt it was okay, even though he knew they would be driving, because he wanted to bring them closer to Judaism.
Right.
And that's a major problem.
Excellent.
What do you do?
Okay,
You not
so
invite them?
excellent. Okay, excellent. So you've all raised excellent points. You have to know who you're talking to. You also should be comfortable when necessary, when it's right, to share what you're comfortable doing and what the parameters are. Here's what basically there's two opinions. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, which is more what Ayala, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is in line with what Ayala said, and Rav Moshe Sternbuch is more in line with what Alani and what Jerry, the approach that the two of you are sharing. And I really basically have taken that approach usually of Rav Sternbuch. Rav Shlomo Zalman says like this. Rav Shlomo Zalman says that you're allowed to, now look, there's some people who are more stringent and more rigid on this, but Rav Shlomo Zalman feels that try to create a permitted scenario. And the way to do that is when you invite the person, invite them to stay over for Shabbat. If they don't take you up on it, like Ayala said, if they take you up on it, wonderful. If they don't take you up on it, okay, they can still come for the meal because you presented a permitted option for them. And they're the ones who chose not to take advantage of the option, and they can come to you for the meal. That's what Shlomo Zalman paskin once, I think, for Or Sameach, for the Kiruv, or for Kiruv. Rav Moshe Sternbuch says takes a different approach. Rav Moshe Sternbuch says it's not a michshol, like Lani said. That's exactly like how he put it, Lani, which is it's a little bit like a doctor does a surgery on someone, and it might hurt the person, objectively speaking, but it's for the long-term benefit and health of the person. So then, of course, the doctor, does the procedure, does the surgery for the long-term health of the person. In business, right? You don't need the business acumen of a Martin Shandling to know that you have to invest money and give away money to make money, right? So when it comes to Shabbos, Rav Sternbuch says the person is going to be violent. If you don't have him over for a meal, he'll be in his house, or he'll be going to the beach, going to the movies, or in his house watching TV, not having Kiddush, not having Zmiros, not having Torah. But if you invite them for the meal, okay, they'll drive. You're causing them to drive, so that it is causing them to drive to your home, because otherwise they wouldn't drive to your home. But they might drive. Good chance they'll drive otherwise. And if they come to your home, overall, the hope is that they'll bring them closer to Yiddishkeit, they'll fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush. They'll have a good feeling of Yiddishkeit and halacha, and who knows, maybe one day they'll keep more of Shabbos and they'll completely keep Shabbos. So Rav Sternbuch says that he says better that they don't park right in front of your house. Okay. But other than that, he feels that you could have them for Shabbos because it's not considered a michshol. The long-term benefit is such that it's for the benefit of the person, because they wouldn't have kept Shabbos anyway. So at least this way they're getting the mitzvahs into being brought closer, whether it's Shabbos or the Pesach Seder, like Jerry, that you said. And that's really more of the approach. I think many many take that approach of Rosh Hashanah, which is, look, like let's say you invite for the bar mitzvah. Yeah, of course you should invite, if you have family members, of course you should try to create a scenario where they could stay near the shul, near your house where you're having the Friday night meal. But if it's a situation where they're going to drive, so then you're permitted to invite them. Again, that every situation is different also. But I believe that Rav Sternbuch is a basis to rely on, which is that you can invite somebody to your house for Shabbos, even if they're going to drive, because what's the alternative? The alternative is anyway they're going to be violating Shabbos, and then they're going to be missing out on the Kiddush. And you know what? Through their affiliation, connection to you, and hearing the Kiddush and everything, who knows? Maybe they'll take upon themselves to not drive. And who knows? Depending upon the person, Rochelle mentioned this before, and you have to know who you're talking to in your relationship. Maybe you'll be able to get into a conversation at some point with them. Not during the meal, but at some point with, hey, want to maybe take upon yourself some greater level of Shabbos observance. Now, what I want to end off with, which is, are you ever allowed to say this net effect idea? It's basically saying, it's not an obstacle and it's not a stumbling block because it's for the long-term net effect positive for the person. Can you say something like that? So I think maybe this is dependent upon the two ways we looked at it before. If you say that the nature of the prohibition is causing somebody to stumble, or giving a person bad spiritual advice, but we just made an argument to say that maybe it's overall better for the person to at least attend the Shabbat meal. However, if you say that the nature of the prohibition is when you cause a person to commit an Aveira, it's as if you yourself committed the Aveira, as if you yourself committed the sin, then it's harder to make this net effect argument. It's harder to say, I can do an Aveira now because I'm going to do more mitzvahs later. We don't say that. We just do it. That's not the way the halachic system works. So perhaps that's the debate between Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rav Sternbuch. Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach sees it more the second way, which is that you're causing somebody to drive on Shabbos. In a certain sense, that means you're like driving on Shabbos. You can't do that. So you have to make sure to at least create that permitted scenario. However, Rav Sternbuch and Lonnie and Jerry's grandfather, right? They understood that it's all about you're not allowed to drive on Shabbat. But when it comes to causing another person to drive, then there's more flexibility there, because if it's causing a person to drive when they're probably going to drive anyway, and at least they're going to drive to your house where they're going to have all the benefits of a Shabbat meal after they drive, then you could make the argument and say, you're not giving them bad advice. It's actually something that's for the long-term benefit for the person. Anyway, so that's the takeaway for all of us is to do mitzvot and to try to be a role model and be a positive influence on others to get them to do mitzvot. That's one of the greatest things. If you could do something in a way that enables other people to do mitzvot, and if you could always act in a way where you're sensitive to make sure that it never leads to somebody else to do an Aveira. So that's what this year is all about, the responsibility we have for one another, and to be a light, and to do mitzvahs on our own, but also to act in a way that encourages others, of course, never to commit a sin, but to encourage others to do mitzvot. Yasher Koach, thank you so much. Laila Tov.
Thank you, Laila.
Thank you.
Rabbi, I'll give you fruit when you come to my house. I'll serve fruit.
You'll share fruit? Okay, good.
So no ice cream, no
ice cream for dessert.
no discussion,
Thank
fruit.
you. Yasher Koach.
I had a friend, I used to play